The guest bedroom wasn't even a guest bedroom anymore. That's what I kept thinking as I lay on the fold-out cot my daughter-in-law had set up in the corner of the laundry room, a room that still smelled like fabric softener and mildew, no matter how many times I'd scrubbed the baseboards. I was 67 years old. I had worked 31 years as a registered nurse. I had raised my son in a house I paid for with my own hands, my own overtime shifts, my own sleepless nights. And now I was listening to the spin cycle finish its second round while the woman he married slept in the master suite down the hall. I want you to understand something before I tell you what happened next. I didn't stay because I was weak. I stayed because I loved my son more than I loved my own comfort, and because grief does something to a person that no one warns you about. When you lose a husband of 34 years, the world becomes very, very small. You stop being able to imagine yourself clearly. You just exist inside the shape of whatever love is still left nearby. That's the only honest way I know to explain it. My husband passed in October, 14 months before any of this began. A stroke, quick and final, on a Tuesday afternoon while he was raking leaves in the backyard. He was 69. We had plans, a road trip up the coast of Maine, a grandchild we were hoping for, a kitchen renovation we'd been arguing about pleasantly for 6 years. All of it simply stopped existing, the way a song stops when someone pulls the plug on the radio. My son called me every day for the first 2 weeks, then every other day. Then, by December, my daughter-in-law started answering the phone instead, and her updates were brief and cheerful in the particular way that means someone is managing you rather than talking to you. She told me I needed to get out of that empty house. She said it wasn't healthy. She said they had plenty of room, and she and my son wanted me close. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked exactly what plenty of room meant, and whose name was going to be on what, and why she kept saying we in a way that somehow left my son out of the conversation. But I was 66 years old, and I had just buried my husband, and the silence in my house was so loud some nights I thought it would split me open. So I said yes. I sold the house my husband and I had owned for 22 years. I sold it because my daughter-in-law said it made more financial sense than renting it out. She had a spreadsheet. She showed it to me on her laptop over FaceTime, scrolling quickly through numbers I couldn't quite read in time. She had a way of making generosity feel like the only logical choice, which I would later understand was a skill she had been practicing for a long time. I cleared $112,000 from the sale, after paying off what remained of the mortgage. My daughter-in-law suggested I put it into a joint account to help cover household expenses and eventually contribute to a larger home with a dedicated in-law suite. She said the word suite the way a hotel brochure does, like it was already decorated and waiting for me. I told her I'd think about it. I thought about it for 3 days, during which she mentioned it 6 more times in 6 different registers. Practical, then warm, then slightly wounded, then practical again. I didn't put the money in a joint account. That was the one decision I made correctly in those first months, and I didn't even make it for the right reasons. I made it because something in me wasn't ready to let go of the last physical thing that connected me to the life my husband and I had built. I put the money in a CD at my credit union, and I didn't tell anyone. I moved into their house in January. It was a 4-bedroom colonial in a suburb 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. Clean, well-maintained, the kind of house that looks like it was assembled by someone who had studied other houses very carefully. My son had bought it 3 years earlier with a down payment that included $30,000 my husband and I had given him as a wedding gift, though that detail seemed to have faded from everyone's memory by the time I arrived with my 2 suitcases and my husband's old reading chair. The reading chair was the first thing. "Oh," my daughter-in-law said when the movers brought it in. She was standing in the entryway with her arms crossed loosely, wearing the expression of someone who is trying very hard not to say what they are actually thinking. I wasn't sure that was coming. "It was his," I said. "Of course." She smiled. "We'll figure out where it fits." It ended up in the basement. For the first 2 months, things were manageable. I cooked dinner 3 or 4 nights a week because I genuinely wanted to help, and because standing in a kitchen gave me somewhere to put my hands. My son was traveling for work more than he used to. He managed logistics for a regional distribution company, and the hours were unpredictable. My daughter-in-law worked from home, which meant she was always there, always present in the house in a low-level, ambient way that I slowly began to find difficult to describe. She wasn't cruel. Not exactly. She was precise. She had a precise way of setting the table that made it clear my casserole dish didn't belong on it. A precise way of reorganizing the refrigerator after I'd loaded the groceries. A precise way of suggesting that my nighttime television habits were affecting her sleep, even though our rooms were separated by a full bathroom and a linen closet. She had 2 sisters who visited often. They were women with sharp laughs and a shorthand between them that excluded everyone else. And when they came, I found reasons to stay in my room. My room was the 3rd bedroom, next to the one they used for storage. It had a window that faced the side of the neighbor's garage. It was fine. I told myself it was fine. The first time something happened that I could not dismiss, it was a Wednesday in March. I had come downstairs early to make coffee and found my daughter-in-law at the kitchen table with a folder of papers in front of her. She looked up without surprise, which told me she had heard me on the stairs. She pushed the folder to the side of the table with one smooth motion and said, "Good morning." I asked her what she was working on. "Just some financial planning," she said. Actually, Mom, she had started calling me Mom in a way that never stopped feeling like a costume. "I've been meaning to talk to you about your will." I said I had a will. "I know. But has it been updated recently? Since Dad passed? Because a lot of people don't realize that certain assets can get tied up in probate, and if something happened to you, it could be very complicated for everyone." "I've been doing some research." I looked at her across the kitchen and said nothing. "There's actually a really simple solution," she said. "My sister's husband is an estate attorney. He does this all the time. He could update everything so that it flows properly. No complications, no delays. He'd do it as a family courtesy." She smiled. "Just something to think about." I said I would think about it. I drove to my own attorney's office 2 days later. Her name was Patricia, and she had done my and my husband's estate planning 8 years earlier. I told her what my daughter-in-law had said. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she asked if anything had changed in my living situation. I told her everything. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. She said that what I was describing had a name. She called it a pattern. She said she saw it more often than I would imagine, and that it tended to escalate incrementally, which was exactly why it worked because each individual step seemed small enough to explain away. I asked her what she thought my daughter-in-law actually wanted. Patricia told me to look at my will. My will left everything to my son. If my son predeceased me, to my son's children, or if there were no children, to my sister. Patricia pointed out that if my daughter-in-law convinced me to have the will revised by her brother-in-law, a man who had no professional obligation to me, the resulting document might redirect my estate in ways I wouldn't fully understand until it was too late to contest them. I sat in that office for a very long time. On the drive home, I passed the exit for the neighborhood where I'd lived for 22 years. I thought about my husband. I thought about how he used to fall asleep in his reading chair on Sunday afternoons, the newspaper folded in his lap. I thought about how his chair was in the basement of a house where I was sleeping in a room that faced another building's wall, being managed with spreadsheets and smiles. I started paying attention differently after that. I started noticing when my son's face went carefully neutral during dinner. I started noticing how my daughter-in-law always positioned herself slightly between us in the living room. Not obviously, just enough. I started noticing that the conversations I used to have with my son, long, wandering conversations about nothing in particular, the kind you can only have with someone who has known you your entire life, had become short and slightly formal, like talking to a polite stranger at a party. She was not a loud or dramatic person. She was a quiet architect. She had been building something for a long time, and I was only now learning to read the blueprints. In May, her sister and brother-in-law visited for a long weekend. They were given my son and daughter-in-law's room. My son and daughter-in-law took the guest room. I was given a pile of extra blankets and a politely apologetic explanation about how the cot in the laundry room was actually surprisingly comfortable and how it would just be for the weekend. It was the first weekend. By the 3rd visit, no one apologized anymore. The brother-in-law, the estate attorney, shook my hand at dinner that first night and mentioned he'd heard I might be interested in updating some documents. He had a card ready. I took it because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. At 2 in the morning, I sat on that cot in the laundry room with the hum of the dryer that wasn't running and the smell of someone else's detergent, and I thought about the $93,000 still sitting in a CD at my credit and union. And I thought, this is what they're waiting for. Not the will as it exists now. They're waiting for the version of the will they're going to help me write. I called Patricia the next morning from my car in the grocery store parking lot. She asked me if anything had changed. I told her about the laundry room. I told her about the brother-in-law and the card. She was quiet for only a moment before she told me there was someone she wanted me to talk to. His name was Daniel. He was a social worker who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. Patricia had referred clients to him before. She told me to think of it not as reporting anything, not yet, but as understanding my options. I want to stop here for a second and tell you something that I think matters. I am not a woman who asks for help easily. I spent 3 decades as a nurse, which means I spent 3 decades being the person in the room who managed other people's worst days. The idea of walking into someone's office and saying, "My daughter-in-law is doing something I can't quite name, and I'm sleeping on a cot in the laundry room of a house my own money helped make possible." It felt almost embarrassing to say out loud, but I thought about my husband. I thought about how he used to say that pride was the most expensive thing a person could own, and I thought about all the women like me, women who had worked and saved and given and trusted, who ended up in rooms they didn't belong in because they had loved more than they had protected themselves. So I made the call. Daniel met me at a coffee shop near Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon. He was younger than I expected, calm in a way that was professional rather than distant. He listened to everything. He asked very specific questions. He asked about the joint account suggestion, about the estate attorney's card, about the name on the deed of my son's house, about what documents I had with me, and what documents I had left behind. When I was done, he asked if he could connect me with someone at the County Adult Protective Services office, not to file anything formally, but to document the pattern in case it was needed later. I said yes. Then he asked me something I wasn't expecting. He asked if I had ever considered that my son might not know the full extent of what was happening. I thought about my son's careful, neutral face at dinner. I thought about the way he sometimes started a sentence in my direction, and then seemed to lose the thread of it before it finished. I thought about the boy who used to climb into my lap during thunderstorms and tell me that if I was there, he wasn't scared of anything. I said I thought he knew some of it. Daniel said that wasn't the same as knowing all of it. What happened next took 11 weeks. I'm not going to describe every meeting and every phone call, because some of it is still legally sensitive, and some of it is simply too exhausting to relive in detail. What I will tell you is this. When Patricia's office contacted the estate attorney, my daughter-in-law had recommended not to confront him, just to request a copy of any documents he had discussed with me in a professional capacity. His response was illuminating in ways he had not intended. There were draft documents. He had already drafted them. There was a version of my will that left everything to my son, which would have seemed fine on its surface, except that there was also a secondary document proposing that my son's interest be held in a family trust that my daughter-in-law administered. The CD at my credit union was referenced by approximate amount in notes that had no business existing given that I had never told him it existed. Patricia called me at 8 in the morning on a Tuesday with that information. I was sitting in my car in the driveway because I had taken to spending mornings in my car before going back inside. I asked her how he knew about the money. She said she didn't know yet, but that it suggested someone had been doing more research than a family courtesy would warrant. That afternoon, I called my son from a park 3 miles from the house and asked him to meet me there. Alone. He arrived 20 minutes later, looking like a man who had not been sleeping well, which I had noticed, but had not wanted to name. I told him everything. Not accusingly, not dramatically. The way a nurse tells a patient what the test results say clearly, without softening it to the point of dishonesty, but with enough steadiness in my voice that the information itself could land without being tangled up in how I was delivering it. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "She told me you had offered to contribute to a trust." She showed me a text conversation. I told him I had never sent that conversation. He put his face in his hands. When he looked up, he looked like he was 17 years old again. The way he had the night he called me from a friend's house and told me he'd made a bad decision and needed me to come get him. He looked like someone who had been let down by the version of events he'd been given and was only now understanding there had been another version the whole time. We talked for 2 hours. He cried once. I held his hand like he was small again, which he is not, but which felt necessary. He asked me what I needed. I told him I needed to stop sleeping in the laundry room, for a start. My daughter-in-law's brother-in-law surrendered his notary commission 3 months later following a state bar complaint that Patricia and Daniel helped me file. The details of my daughter-in-law's involvement in the preparation of those draft documents that had been created without my knowledge or consent, were referred to the county attorney's office as a matter involving potential elder financial exploitation. I am not going to tell you that justice was swift or cinematic. It wasn't. These things move slowly, and the outcome was not a courtroom scene with a sentence handed down in a single dramatic moment. What happened was quieter, and in some ways more complete than that. The documents were voided. The credit union flagged the inquiry that had been made into my account. An inquiry made by someone who should not have had access to my records, and that finding became part of a larger report. My daughter-in-law moved out of the house in October, 7 months after that conversation in the park. The separation was my son's decision, and it was not one he made easily or quickly, and I have sat with him through many nights since then when it still doesn't feel clean or resolved, because it doesn't, because these things don't. What I can tell you is that I am no longer sleeping on a cot in a laundry room. I used part of the money from my CD to rent a small apartment 10 minutes from my son's house, 1 floor up, with windows that face a proper street, and a second bedroom where my husband's reading chair finally sits against a wall that belongs to me. My son comes for dinner on Sundays. We talk for a long time about nothing in particular, the kind of conversations I had been missing without knowing exactly what to call the missing. There is something that Patricia told me in our first meeting that I have thought about many times since. She said that the people who end up in situations like mine are almost never naive. They are almost always people who had very good reasons to trust the people who eventually let them down. She said that love is not the mistake. The mistake is believing that love made that legal protection unnecessary. My husband and I never thought to put our assets in a trust that protected my rights of occupancy. We never thought to make sure that our gifts to our son were documented as gifts and not as informal understandings. We never thought to talk to our attorney when the living arrangements changed, because it was family. And we were family people, and family people don't lawyer up against their own children. I am telling you this now because someone you know is in a situation like mine and doesn't have the words for it yet. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's you. The situation doesn't have to look dramatic from the outside to be damaging from the inside. It can look like a cot in a laundry room and a spreadsheet on a laptop and a sister's husband with a business card and a smile. The document that saved me was not anything I found or uncovered. It was the one I already had my own will, unchanged, sitting in Patricia's file cabinet where I had left it 8 years ago when my husband and I were still planning a road trip to Maine and arguing pleasantly about the kitchen. The call that changed everything was the one I almost didn't make, because I was embarrassed, and because I had spent 67 years being the person who handled things rather than the person who asked for help. I made it anyway. My husband would have told me to make it sooner. He would have said exactly that, sitting in his reading chair, newspaper folded in his lap, the way he always did when I was too proud to admit I needed something. I know that now. I carry it forward. If you are sitting somewhere tonight in a room that doesn't feel like yours, inside a situation you keep finding reasons to explain away, please understand that getting help is not a betrayal of the people you love. Sometimes it is the only way to find out who they actually are. And sometimes, on the other side of it, what you find is that the son who used to tell you he wasn't scared of anything during thunderstorms is still in there, still yours, still worth every single difficult step it took to reach him. That part, at least, turned out to be true.